What about the Palestinians? Let's give our attention to Dr. McDermott.
Did the Jews steal the land? Usually what's implied by that question, and that is usually put in the form of a statement, not a question, that the Jews stole the land from Arab Palestinians. Usually what's implied is that the Jews of Israel never tried to share the land. That's not true. Jews have lived alongside Gentiles in Israel for over 3,000 years, as Dr. Young said this morning. Jews in the 20th century, the Jews of Israel accepted partition plans more than 4 times. And each of those partition plans was rejected by Arabs. Now, the first of the partition plans of the 20th century was in 1920, and I'd like to show you with a few maps this. A few moments. Okay, well, in the meantime, I'll say a few things. So the Jewish national home was first mandated by the League of Nations in 1920. 1920. And this mandate by the League of Nations, and you all know the League of Nations was started principally by President Woodrow Wilson after World War I. This mandate by the League of Nations to establish a Jewish national home was pretty much, I was going to say indirect, more of a direct result of the Balfour Declaration I talked about last night in 1917. So extremely important, that Balfour Declaration. So in 1920, the League of Nations establishes or mandates a Jewish national home, which, as you'll see, okay, there it is. That's the mandate for Palestine, the British mandate, that is the League of Nations assigned control of this territory to Britain with the stipulation that this be the Jewish national home. Look how big it is. Look, notice it includes the country of what is now Jordan. All of this was to be the Jewish national home. But so on both sides of the Jordan, both sides of Jordan was supposed to go to the Jews. Now, why would they give such a big part to the Jews? Well, because as you'll see in the later map, I don't need it yet, but in a later map, you will see that what the Jews were eventually left with, in roughly what we now know as the State of Israel, is 1/640th of the land area that the Arabs already had. 1/640th. So this was not considered overly generous to give to the Jews. Now, what they did, for various political reasons, their minds changed, and they gave 80% of this to the Arabs. This area that was originally meant to be all for the Jews, they took off 80% and gave it to the Arabs, and they started Transjordan, which is now the country of Jordan. And yet, when you look at the 20% that was left, they divided even that 20% between Jews and Arabs. So the Jews finally got only 17.5% of what was originally mandated to be theirs. Now, let's look at the next map, please. So Transjordan was broken off and given to the Arabs, and the rest was given to Jewish Palestine. But then, as you know, then the Jews didn't even get all of what is said to be Jewish Palestine on there. So in in 1947, before the war, and before the official establishment of the State of Israel, 1947, official establishment was 1948, you know, and the war was 1948, 1949. Before this, in 1947, the British were withdrawing. The British withdrew. After World War II, their resources and their energies were, and their motivation were all depleted by the war. And they just withdrew. Now, sound familiar? Withdrew from the Middle East. Sound familiar? Yeah. So they gave it over to the UN. And in 1947, the UN offered a partition plan to the Jews and Arabs to partition what you see on there is called Jewish Palestine. Now, some say the partition was unfair to the Arabs because the Arabs were 93% at the time, in 1947. The Arab population was 93% of the population of Palestine. And yet, 78% of the land was given to the Jews. But here's the key to understanding that, and Dr. Young mentioned this briefly this morning, that the Jewish part, the Jewish part of that land that was offered in this 1947 UN partition had a substantial majority of Jews in it. In the Jewish part of the partition, there were 538,000 Jews and only 397,000 Arabs.
Could you repeat that number again?
Yeah, 538,000 to 397,000. And lest you think those numbers are fishy, they come from the UN. Or maybe I shouldn't use the word lest. Jews were not happy with the partition because they did not get Jerusalem, where Jews had been a majority since the mid-19th century. And 60% of what they were given was the Negev Desert, which back then was thought to be arid and useless. But the Jews accepted the 1947 UN partition plan, and the Arabs rejected it. And a few hours after the Jews established their state and announced it to the world, the Arab armies on all sides invaded and went to war against this new fledgling, hours-old state of Israel. The Jews, against all odds, won the war, and the armistice lines after the 1948 war still left Jews with a relatively small area. Third and last slide, please. Whoops. Well, we don't have a picture of the armistice lines, but you know the armistice lines. Basically, it was Israel without the West Bank and without Gaza and without the Sinai Peninsula. So basically, the present state of Israel now, Israel proper, minus the West Bank, and that Israel, that land of Israel that was left with the armistice lines in 1948, represents 1/640th, as I said, of Arab lands. So there it is, that tiny little piece. All the rest of these are Arab lands. And the Arabs, with the exception of Egypt and Jordan, who have signed peace treaties with Israel, and more or less keep it, except when they invade 1967, in the 1990s, the peace treaties. All the rest of these Arab countries have taken up a hostile attitude toward Israel, a warlike attitude toward Israel, claiming that the Jews have too much land. Now look at that. Do you think the Jews have too much land in comparison to the Arab lands? And these are Arab countries that have not offered to take any of these Palestinian refugees. have not offered to help these Palestinian refugees. None have offered land to the Palestinians or let refugees settle in their countries. And by the way, there's a lot of talk today about when will the Palestinians get a state? Well, you know what? The Palestinians are a majority of the Jordanian population. You know, despite what the official government figures are, the Palestinians are a vast majority of Jordanians. So they already have a state. Now, admittedly, Palestinians are not in control of that state. The Hashemite dynasty is. But nevertheless, and as Dr. Young said this morning, and I think Dr. Miller also mentioned this, the Palestinian Authority controls most of the West Bank. And Hamas controls all of Gaza. So the Palestinians have Palestinian governments. Not full-fledged government with military power. On the other hand, they do have military power. You know, especially Hamas down in Gaza. So, keep these things in mind. But did they steal the land in 1948? No. They won the land in 1948 after winning a war that they did not start. And they bought the land they have fairly. By 1947, Great Britain had allocated 187,500 acres of cultivated land to Arabs and 4,250 acres of cultivated land to Jews. Jews paid outrageous prices to wealthy, absentee Arab landowners, $1,000 an acre by 1947, when rich black soil in Iowa was selling for $110 an acre. By 1947, 73% of the Jews who bought land had bought from large landowners, including Arab mayors of Gaza, Jerusalem, and Jaffa, and leaders of the Arab national movement. They sold the land to Jews. King Abdullah of Jordan, in his memoirs, wrote, quote, "The story of the displacement of Arabs from their lands is a fiction." Now this is King Abdullah. He's not a Jew. Arabs, he said, are as prodigal in selling their land as they are in weeping about it. Now, were Arabs forced to leave their lands in 1948 because of the wars, because of the Jewish soldiers? It's true that hundreds of thousands of Arabs felt compelled to abandon their homes during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. They fled the violence of war, which was begun by Arab nations, not by Israel. Now, the majority simply wanted to get out of the line of fire. And Jewish fighters, in some instances, did use psychological warfare to encourage Arabs to abandon a few villages. And in the Ramla Lod, region, right by where Tel Aviv Airport is now, some Jewish fighters forced some Arabs to move a few miles away to an area that was occupied by the Arab Legion. But most of the Arabs who left did so because they were encouraged to leave by Arab leaders. The Syrian Prime Minister, Khaled al-Azam, wrote in his memoirs, quote, "Since 1948, we have been demanding the return of the refugees to their homes, but we ourselves are the ones who encourage them to leave," close quote. Now, the British journal or magazine, The Economist, which some of you have read, which is was back then and still is today a frequent critic of Zionists, reported in their October 2nd, 1948 issue that, quote, "The higher Arab executive clearly intimated that those Arabs who remained in Haifa and accepted Jewish protection would be regarded as renegades." And so they left, following Arab direction. When anyone feels forced to abandon their home, it's a tragedy. But this cannot be blamed solely or mainly on Jews in 1948, nor can it be called theft without disregard for the historical context. Now, is Israel violating international law? How many of you have heard it claimed ad nauseum that Israel is violating international law by its continued occupation, partial occupation of the West Bank? Many agree with the allegation, most of the media seems to agree with the allegation that Israel's continued occupation of the West Bank is a violation of international law, especially or specifically UN Resolution 242. How many of you have heard that Resolution 242 bandied about for the last 20 years in the media? Now, according to Resolution 242, Israeli withdrawal was to take place in the context of Arab-Israeli mutual recognition of the right to exist and territorial adjustments to achieve secure boundaries. Both Arthur Goldberg and Lord Carrington, the primary authors of Resolution 242, have said that the word "the" was purposely omitted because it was not intended for Israel to give back all of her territories, since they recognized that some were needed for secure boundaries. So they were ordered to withdraw from territories, not the territories. Now, despite the fact that most Arab states have refused to recognize Israel's right to exist, which was a condition of Resolution 242, nevertheless, Israel has implemented the principles of the resolution 3 times. When Egypt terminated its claims of belligerency in 1979 in the Camp David Accords, then Israel returned the Sinai. Now, do you realize that the Sinai Peninsula, which is mineral rich, natural resources rich, was 90% of the occupied territories? Israel gave up 90% of the occupied territories when it gave up the Gaza Peninsula. When Jordan signed the peace agreement, a second time Israel returned land claimed by Jordan. Then in September 2005, the third time, Israel unilaterally withdrew from Gaza, hoping that they would get peace in exchange for land, only to be met with new attacks on her civilians launched from that territory. The charge of illegal occupation must therefore be rejected. The country of Israel has made repeated efforts to comply with UN stipulations for the territories, while her Arab neighbors have not. When the Palestinians appeared to accept Israel's right to exist during the Oslo negotiations, which, as you recall, were between 1993 and 1995, then Israel turned over control of major West Bank cities to the Palestinian Authority, PA. But when the PA showed support for terrorist attacks on Israeli citizens in 2000, then Israel resumed control of her cities, which you better believe Americans would do. In that same year, Israel offered to return, and many of us remember this, in 2000, Israel offered to return 92% of the West Bank, but Palestinians turned the offer down. Some dismiss the offer as ungenerous because they claim Israel never owned the land in the first place. They claim that. Yet Jews have lived in ancient Samaria, the West Bank, for over 3,000 years. But that's not all. I remember the moment some years ago when I first learned, I was shocked, that Jordan unilaterally renounced all claims to the West Bank in 1988 and released legal ownership to Israel at that time. How many of you knew that? That alone helped me realize that the claim of Israel's illegality in continuing to partially control the West Bank was bogus. But many anti-Zionists are either unaware of this or they purposely ignore it and suggest Jews, as Dr. Miller was just telling us, should remove all settlements from the West Bank, leaving it entirely for Palestinians. Judenrein. And you know who used that word before, Judenrein, in Deutsch, German, for an area free of Jews? A man by the name of Adolf, some decades ago. But that would be as unreasonable as insisting that no Arabs can live in Judea or the Galilee. Yet most Jews in Israel are happy to live with 2 million Arab Israeli citizens in Judea and Galilee as their neighbors. And besides, what other country has been required to give up land that it won in a defensive war? Do Germans who were displaced from Königsberg clamor and agitate for that German city to be returned to them by the victorious Russians, formerly Soviets? Königsberg was in Prussia, controlled and owned by Germans until 1945, when the Soviets swept in their march west to Germany. And they took it over and the Soviets renamed it Kaliningrad when the Soviets beat Nazi Germany. The Germans realized today, they started World War II, they lost it to the Soviets, and now they have no right to reclaim it. In conclusion, Jews did not steal the land. Second, they're not violating international law by controlling parts of the West Bank. Third, the nation of Israel is not perfect. It's made mistakes. But in general, stealing land and breaking international law are not among the mistakes. Thank you.